Good evening. My name is Marla Maybrook, and I'm the Health and Temperance Director of the Woodbury Seventh-day Adventist Church. I'd like to welcome you to our series called MindFit. And we're going to be talking about mental health. Millions across America are struggling with mental health. Over 20% of Americans and Canadians experience mental health issues or illness in any given year. So we're going to be talking about in this series about this epidemic and what can be done to fight it, and how can you help and how can you get involved. So we're going to start each evening with a video. We have a series of 4 tonight, tomorrow night, which is Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday night. And we'll be doing each of those at 7 p.m. And we're going to start with the video, and the video is presented by Alex Rodriguez. And he's going to add some light on our current mental health crisis. And the problems are really deep, but there is hope. There is real hope for those struggling with mental illness and for those who are caretakers and for those who love them, those who are going through the mental illness. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our video tonight, and it's entitled Beyond the Asylum.
Do you have any good scars? I do. Some of them I can show you and some I cannot.
I don't know if you've ever boxed, but it's like going 9 rounds.
On this side, you have reckless, careless. You get to the other side where we find panic, fear, you freeze.
I sit on the edge of my bed for 30 minutes just contemplating what to put on. Who cares? They're clothes.
Mental health is really important.
You have a chemical imbalance.
What we're really talking about is who we are, who we were meant to be.
Well, is everybody good? And everybody's not good.
Late one night, a good friend and fellow police officer came by my place, frantic. We sat in the living room and he began to break down crying. Took out his service pistol and said, "I need you to take this. I don't trust myself with it right now." I threw my world into a tailspin. Those years in emergency services hadn't prepared me for a friend wanting to take his own life. About 3 days later, he called asking for his gun back. I hadn't told anyone because I was sure it would cost him his job. On the other hand, if he used it on himself, I don't know if I could ever forgive myself. It all worked out. But what if it hadn't? Mental illness is real, and I've seen too much to sit still any longer. I want to personally invite you to join me on a journey towards mental fitness. I'm going to talk to some experts and meet some real everyday people who are going to help us understand what it feels like to live with mental illness each and every day. The ocean waters of Cape Cod at Massachusetts Bay. Stunningly beautiful, but treacherously dangerous. Which is why behind me is the famous Cape Cod Lighthouse, or the Highland Light as it came to be called. Commissioned by George Washington and built in 1797, this blazing soldier of the night was a beacon of hope for the mariners who would brave the wild tides under its command. Now, the town of Truro, where the Highland Light resides, was originally settled under the name Dangerfield, a bit of a prophetic declaration of what the future would hold for those who dared test the seas. Of these waters, the American poet Henry David Thoreau, in his book Cape Cod, penned, "I found it that it would not do to speak of shipwrecks there, for almost every family has lost some of its members at sea." Today, the Highland Light still stands, shining beams of hope into the darkness and guiding sailors through despairing storms. Perhaps it was this feeling of hope that drew Thoreau to the Cape Cod Lighthouse in the first place. You see, his life had been filled with tragedies, uncertainties, and wreckage that haunted his days, filled his dreams, and threatened to rob his sanity. Henry David Thoreau is known by many as a writer, poet, and botanist, but he was also widely lauded for his contribution to government, politics, and even abolitionism. To some, he was regarded as America's original genius. But I think the most intriguing aspect of Thoreau, maybe the less known, is his battle with mental health. After comprehensive studies of Thoreau's life, his journals, and his writings, researchers have found that he showed signs of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. We can't go back in time and know exactly what was going on inside his head, but he did leave us with over 2 million written words, and from his writings, it's clear that the struggle for mental fitness was real. I believe it was the plaguing nature of his thoughts that led him to escape to Walden Pond for 2 years. Thoreau used this time at Walden, his self-awareness, and other forms of self-help to navigate his deep emotional and psychological issues. He didn't have the understanding of the mind or the treatment options that we have today, which makes his life story and accomplishments even more remarkable. However, one thing is for sure, his journey offers us an example of strength and a beacon of light that there is hope beyond the asylum.
And when a patient is coming to me and they're struggling and they're not sure where to go next, oftentimes one of the big things that they're struggling with is a lack of hope. Like, I don't know where I'm gonna go with this. I don't know how I'm gonna get better. Is there even hope for me, doc? And so I think the most important thing is inspiring hope in people, helping people to realize that they can get better, helping people to realize that they're not alone, helping people to realize that other people have gone before them and struggle with similar problems and often even worse symptoms and bigger struggles, and they've made it through to the other side and they've gotten through that. This is one of the big challenges when I think about treating mental illness and the stigma that's often out there, is we really want people to understand there is no shame in getting help.
I retired from the fire department in 2018. I didn't realize at the time, police, fire, military, EMS workers, when they leave their job, there's like a really high rate of depression, anxiety, suicide, all of it. There was no talk about this. One of my captains would tell me the story about how he was shot down in the same day twice. And they went back and got another helicopter and went and flew another mission. So, without being said, that's saying shut up.
Stigma is the disgrace that we place around any kind of identity or sometimes behavior. Stigma is inherent to human culture. Every culture of every people around every part of the world through time, there have been ideas of what is right, what is normal, what is abnormal. Stigma is how we enforce that. Stigma is not biological. We are not hardwired for stigma. And part of the way that we know that is if we look at the things we stigmatize and look at them cross-culturally, we can see that in other cultures, something that may be very stigmatizing for us, where we live, is understood very differently and may be valued or honored by someone somewhere else. So it tells us that it is not intrinsic to being human to stigmatize this particular thing. We keep each other from recognizing very regular parts of what it means to be human and seeking care because of the way we understand what it means to be an ideal person.
There's no, hey, let me come over here and pet you after that call you just had. No, because they've seen things that make that look nothing, right? Stigma is the umbrella, and underneath the umbrella would be embarrassment, pride, trying to be macho. You're in a room full of type A guys that are not going to admit a weakness, right? So you go around, you have a conversation about nonsense, and at the end of the conversation, it's like, well, is everybody good? Yep, everybody's good. All right, we're out of here. And everybody's not good.
So for people who are deeply depressed, it's not uncommon. Well, they'll say, you know, my friends say, I just need to go out and exercise. I just need to be around people who are more positive. I can't do that. I'm depressed. If I'm so depressed I can't get off my chair, I would love to go for a walk. I would love to hang out with friends. I actually can't do that. Small, more everyday ways of marginalizing people, dismissing people's experiences, how they interact with everyday life. Cultural laws are sometimes arbitrary, but they're still binding. Something can make no sense at all. It can be absolutely harmful. But because of the way we've always done it, because of the way we understand the meaning of it, we will continue often to do it or to perpetuate it, even when we know that it's not the way we should be interacting with each other. This is a regular part of being a human being. It doesn't make someone less human. It doesn't make them less valuable. It's a regular part of being a human being.
What a stunning view. From this spot at Point Park, atop Lookout Mountain in Chattanooga, one can see the Tennessee River as it winds and bends into what appears to be a moccasin. In fact, that's where it gets its unique name, Moccasin Bend. I've come to take in this remarkable view of the valley below, and more specifically, to get a top-down look at the Moccasin Bend Mental Health Institute. The Bend, as most people around here refer to it, is a psychiatric hospital established in 1961, serving 52 counties in East Tennessee with its 165 adult beds. Most people treated here have a severe and persistent mental illness and are hospitalized on an emergency involuntary basis. It was in the 90s that this facility became entwined in my own life. You see, Chattanooga is my old stomping grounds. I lived, went to school, and worked here. And I was introduced to this facility when I was a police officer and a fireman. Throughout my emergency services career, the Bend was a place shrouded in mystique and almost infamy. I never personally entered the facility. In fact, I preferred to keep my distance. In those days, the word asylum raised the hairs on the back of my neck. Like the prisons, its inhabitants were there against their will. But unlike the prisons, the Bend housed what I felt were the lunatics of society. Folks that in my mind couldn't reason with you even if they tried. For me, the Bend conjured up images of the insane asylums found in tales and movies. Some of those fears, no doubt, substantiated by the troublesome history of asylums. But most of those fears perpetuated by misunderstanding and misguided biases. It's interesting to note that the word asylum actually means a place of refuge or sanctuary, a fitting description for some of the original institutions which were initially designed as resorts with gorgeous gardens, furnishings, artwork, and the modern accoutrements of the age. However, despite the intended message this word was originally designed to convey, and notwithstanding the moral treatment direction of the 19th century that was to usher in more humane treatment of the mentally ill, history reveals that the asylums of old became less than safe havens or shelters and never quite achieved their intended potential. Today, I hope to get a better understanding of these institutions and the stigma associated with mental illness as related to their history. I'm on the campus of Central State Hospital near Milledgeville, Georgia. Built during the late 1830s and early 40s, in the era of institutionalization and the push for moral treatment of the mentally ill, it quickly became one of the world's largest mental institutions, at its peak housing up to 13,000 patients on a campus of 200 buildings. If these walls could talk, they would tell of the great intentions that we had as a society to create a humane and aesthetically pleasing facility to nurse the mentally ill back to health. It may come as a surprise that asylums weren't always places of cruelty. In fact, they experienced a noble era where much good was accomplished. It's a fascinating story, and one that I need to unpack a bit more, which is why today I'm meeting with asylum expert Carrie Brown, who's going to walk me through the history of this once magnificent facility.
So this facility was actually founded in 1836. Physicians from Georgia actually traveled across the country to other states that already had mental health programs in place. They pulled out what they felt like were the best practices, and then they took in their first patient in 1842.
So Carrie, tell me, who was typically housed in these institutions?
A whole number of folks were housed here. Folks with developmental disabilities, folks with mental illness, folks with seizure disorder, even folks with tuberculosis. Central State in particular was considered a cutting-edge mental health institution, so they did do things that you would normally think about, like lobotomies or electroshock. They did insulin therapy, ice water therapy, all of those kinds of things. But I think it's important for us today to remember that during those times, those treatments were considered cutting-edge science.
Sure. Why were there so many institutionalized at one time compared to now?
Folks came here for all sorts of things throughout the hospital's history that today we would go, why would you be institutionalized for that? At a time that we as a society were starting to understand that mental illness was actually an illness, right? So prior to that, they thought you had demons or that God was punishing you for something.
So there's a lot of scariness and misunderstanding associated to asylums. How has that contributed to the stigma of mental illness?
I think when we think about asylums or mental health institutions, it plays into our fears of the unknown, right? We as people tend to be afraid of what we don't understand, and institutions like this were places where you could send the folks in your family that you just didn't want to worry about. Mm-hmm. You know, you just sort of push them aside.
Right.
And so I think that feeds into the unknown, the unfamiliar, and then it just sort of adds on to the stigma that we already have. These were kind of considered places where you put people you didn't care about or want to have associated with your family legacy. It's really not, you know, a scary place to be. You know, these are your friends and neighbors.
Central State Hospital is only one of the many necessary institutions helping those with severe mental illness, or SMI for short, which in the U.S. population account for roughly 6.3%. This is but a fraction of the nearly 20%, 1 in 5 of adults in the U.S. who live with mental illness every day. Think about the people you know, family members, friends, co-workers, neighbors. Nearly half of all Americans are at risk for a mental disorder in the course of their lifetime. This means that we are all touched by mental illness. With these kinds of statistics, we should all be experts of sympathy and understanding. Unfortunately, given the hushed nature that often surrounds personal struggles with mental illness, our battles are rarely discussed. If one were honest, no one wants to be classified as mentally ill. and many shudder at the thought of revealing the struggles they face daily. At the core of this kind of thinking, I believe, is fear. And so we fear, we judge, we discriminate based on prejudices, and in so doing, create an environment for stigma to grow and thrive. This stigmatization is keenly felt by those who struggle with mental illness and can have cascading effects on their lives, the lives of their families and friends, and on society as a whole. History is replete with examples of men and women whose lives were dramatically impacted, some even executed when their secret was brought to the open.
Take the Middle Ages through the 18th century, for example, when those with mental illness were labeled as demon-possessed or witches. In the late 1600s, the judges who presided over the Salem witch trials accused over 200 people, sentencing a majority to death or imprisonment. Into the 20th century, while the labels changed, the stigma continued, as seen in the story of Thomas Francis Eagleton. From the 50s to 80s, Eagleton graduated Harvard Law and practiced as an attorney, which led into the political circuit. He climbed from Attorney General to U.S. Senate and then became the vice presidential nominee for the Democratic Party, running with George McGovern. Immediately, news spread that Eagleton had undergone electroshock therapy in the 60s for clinical depression. At the request of McGovern, Eagleton withdrew 18 days after his selection. McGovern lost the general presidential election, placing blame on Eagleton, calling his issue catastrophic. The 21st century has witnessed an increased awareness of the prevalence of mental illness and a renewed zeal to address the growing crisis. Take the greatest decorated Olympian of all time, Michael Phelps. The revealing of his depression and anxiety struggles came as a shock, but also gave hope to many. I mean, how many people do you know who can win a staggering 28 Olympic medals while battling mental illness? No doubt his willingness to speak out while occupying GOAT status in the world of sports, especially swimming, has contributed significantly to the war on stigma. But while most people showed empathy towards him, that hasn't been the case for all. Take Simone Biles, for example, another Olympian at the top of her game and a fan favorite to take it all at the Tokyo Olympics, but who ended up withdrawing from much of her gymnastics participation due to a mental health concern. Many questioned her motives and accused her of being unpatriotic, an accusation that serves only to continue the stigma and to suppress the sufferer's willingness to openly share or ask for help.
If it was really that easy to come to therapy, why are not more people doing it? It's actually hard. It takes a lot of courage for them just to show up. It takes a lot of courage to say, I need help. So a lot of people who are saying it's weakness, well, it's because they also want an excuse to not receive the help that they need. If we don't separate our value and our esteem from others and what they think, it'll always fluctuate. We also do that a lot with our emotions. I am sad. No, I'm not. And not all of me is sad. I feel sad in this moment. Many different cultures actually say, I have this, I feel this, versus I am. You know, they say 60% of people don't access care at all of mental health treatment. That 60% is like the vast majority, and primarily because of stigma. So either they don't come in, or eventually when they do, it's years later. And that is really sad as a clinician to see and experience with them, because what happens is their problems start to compound, right? So they initially had, let's say, trauma, and then they didn't access treatment for that trauma, and so then they try to self-medicate. Then they come in, and now as a clinician, I have to help them with the trauma, the addiction, and then the addiction rupturing their relationships and so forth. You know, if you break a bone and you don't go into the doctor, and years later you're like, you know, it's causing me a lot of pain, I've tried to self-medicate, you go in, what do they gotta do? They gotta re-break the bone.
When I was working in the fire department, your problems weren't my problems. It was just my job to go to your problem and help you out. And we used to go to these calls all the time. You know, I'd go in and go, hey, you know, suck it up. Mental health was not on the table. I don't even remember my first mental health conversation until many, many, many years into it. I believe that every person is one bad event away from a mental health crisis. You're not alone, because there's a lot of people that are muttering through life that are probably feeling this kind of stuff, but they don't know what to do about it.
98% of people recognize that mentally ill people are stigmatized and discriminated against. So we are very aware of the problem, but what's sad is that we don't realize how I am involved in that problem and in that solution.
This history of stigma is complex. These multifaceted issues stacked upon each other over the many hundreds of years have created the barriers we face today. But the good news is that it's not biological. Stigma is learned, and anything that is learned can be unlearned. Much like Judson Brewer said in Unwinding Anxiety, you slip because your brain has grooved your old habits much more deeply than your new ones. That's how the brain works. The path of least resistance is the one we will typically choose. However, if we will clear out a new path and stop walking the old road, eventually the new will become the most familiar. And that's what needs to happen with stigma. We simply need a new road. Mental illness is no respecter of intellect, fame, or culture. For far too long, we've ignored it, choosing to live out an unhealthy and destructive narrative. Those suffering with mental illness deserve to live a full and healthy life, as we all do. We owe it to them, to ourselves, and to the future to create a community of mutual respect and understanding. We must learn from the past in order to extend love and help and healing to those in the present who are suffering. According to the Bible, our duty is to preach good tidings to the poor, heal the brokenhearted, proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison doors to those who are bound, to comfort all who mourn, and to give the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. It is our solemn calling to embrace a society that is hurting. And while not every situation will find a medical or natural cure, how we view mental illness and react to those around us will go a long way to bringing hope to those who fight the daily battle for mental fitness. The Highland Light and lighthouses like it around the world have brought a sense of relief and hope to those who, without its guidance, would have been lost at sea, or worse yet, overcome by the dangers. In the same vein, I believe that awareness and education are the lighthouses of mental illness, shining a light of hope into the darkness and despair. While there is much yet to learn on this important topic of mental health, truth be told, mental illness is a normal and everyday occurrence for hundreds of millions in the world. In the programs that follow, we will be unpacking this statement, along with looking at the most prevalent mental illnesses facing our world today. So you don't want to miss out. Until next time, God bless.
So I'm just going to introduce myself again for those on live stream who maybe weren't at the very beginning. My name is Marla Maybrook, and I'm the Health and Temperance Director of the Woodbury Seventh-day Adventist Church, and we are presenting a series called MindFit. We're starting with a video, and then we have study guides. So those who are physically here received a study guide, and we're going to go through those. And it's a review of the video. And I found that video very interesting. I hope that was enlightening to you as well. And one of the purposes of this series is education. So we can all be educated more on what is happening in the world today regarding mental illness. So if you look at your study guide, we're talking about stigma. Learned a lot about stigma in the video. And stigma is the result of what? What's the study guide say? Fear. It's a result of fear. It's lack of information. It's maybe what we've grown up with, prejudice and bias for a lot of issues. But in regards to mental health, the stigma that we see in society is causing people who have mental health to be socially isolated, they get harassed, they get abused. If they're in the workplace, there's pressures in the workplace against them. And then they just fail to seek medical care. And that's what stigma does to people that are going through mental illness. And stigma has caused 40% of the population that has mental illness to not seek treatment. And that's a lot. That's big. So we want to see what we can do to help remove that stigma in society. So those that are experiencing depression and some of these mental health issues will seek treatment and will seek help. So there's over 8 billion people in the world, and in the United States, about 1 in 5 have mental illness. So if we had 20 people sitting here today, how many people would have mental illness? 4, correct. 4 people would have mental illness. And you could be around people all the time and might not even know that they have mental illness. You could be working with people. You could be sitting next to them in church. You could see them in the grocery store. They could be your neighbors that might have mental illness, because if you think 1 in 5, that's a lot of people that have mental illness. Not all of them seek out treatment, though, unfortunately. It's a major concern today. So why do we think that stigma is still a concern today? And there's 3 points. There's 3 reasons why. The first one is biases and prejudices. That's number 1. They're deep-seated. It's hard to change. You may, as you grew up, you may have the same thoughts that your parents had. If your parents were prejudiced against a certain group of people, you may have those same prejudices because that's how you grew up, and it's deep-seated. And there's an example in the Bible. If you want to look it up, the Bibles that you may have in the pews in front of you, Galatians 2:11-13. It tells a very interesting story. The story is about Peter, and Peter was an apostle of Jesus, and he was a converted man after he denied the Lord. He was converted, but this story just shows how he had prejudices that had been hanging over since his early days. Peter was Jewish, and he went to Antioch. And when he went to Antioch to do missionary work, he ate with the Gentiles, and that was kind of unheard of for the Jewish to eat with the Gentiles. But he ate with the Gentiles because he knew the gospel needed to go to them. But then James came along, and James brought some Jewish friends with him. And the old prejudices came up, and Peter said, I can't eat with these Gentiles anymore. So it's that prejudice that he couldn't eat with them. But even though he had eaten with them, but then under the peer pressure, the old prejudices, he wouldn't eat with them. Well, Paul, who wrote Galatians, he reprimanded Peter. And he called him out on his hypocrisy. And Peter saw his sin and he repented of it. So change takes time. You know, you can be a converted person and you know that you're converted. But sometimes also old prejudices still come up even if you are converted. And we all need to change, but change can take time, like it did in this case of Peter. So the second point of why stigma is alive and well today is because of our sensory overload. So if you walk into a department store at Christmas time, and there's lights, and there's different color lights, and they're blinking, and there's all kinds of gifts, and there's Christmas music, so there's lots of noise, and there's lots of people around, a lot of gifts that are there. It can be sensory overload. And sometimes that happens with mental illness. Sometimes a crisis gets so big that it's sensory overload. So what do? Sometimes we just shut down. We put our heads in the sand and we just say, I can't deal with it. And that's one of the problems today with stigma as well. We just don't want to deal with it. We put our heads in the sand. The third point is that we don't really give enough attention to mental illness. And, you know, we don't give enough education. And so what happens is we don't know how bad the problem really is or what we can do to help it. I mean, we hear the terms. We hear trauma, and you heard them on the video. OCD, oppressive obsessive compulsive disorder, bipolar, schizophrenia. We've heard these terms, but do we really know their true meaning? And that's what we're here today. We're here to learn and to learn more about these terms and what they can mean. So in the Bible, the story of creation, Genesis 1:26, God said, let us make man in what? Our image. In the image of God. So that shows that we're all equal. We're all made in the image of God. There's no distinction between us. And we're equal. And if you see young children, young children want to play. I have 2 children, I have grandchildren, especially I have a 4-year-old grandchild right now. All he wants to do is play. He doesn't care who he plays with. He'll go out on the playground and he'll make friends with whoever. It doesn't matter if they're rich or poor. It doesn't matter if they're black or white. I mean, he will play, he'll play with them. And if someone's willing to play with him, he's going to play with them. It doesn't matter. So when you're little like that, those things don't matter. And when we're little, we don't see those things. But as we start growing up, you know, we develop some of those prejudices. If we could just be like a child and see everybody as equal. So in God's sight, we are all equal. So why do we develop these prejudices and biases? First, 2 points. Number 1, sin. Sin is the reason why we develop these. When we talked about creation, after God made man, and after Adam and Eve sinned after the fall, they started finding fault with each other. Instead of taking responsibility for their own actions, they blamed each other. Oh, the woman made me do it. Oh, the man made me do it. So distrust and hatred filled in their hearts, and that was as a result of sin. And the second point is our mind is like a sponge. So we soak in whatever we're exposed to. So we look at, many people want to send their children to the best schools. Why do they want to do that? Because they know the mind is like a sponge. They want them to learn the best that they can learn and receive the best education that they can receive. So we're the sum of our education, experience, and training. And the Bible says the sins of the fathers are carried down to the 3rd and 4th generation, and that's in Exodus 34:7, if you want to look that up. So what we learn is who we are, and that's often difficult to change. So when I was growing up, we didn't have internet, we didn't have computers, we didn't have cell phones. If I wanted to talk to somebody, I'd have to go on that rotary phone, and later they became push-button phones, and a lot of people here can identify with that. And I'd have to call them up on a landline, as we would call now. We didn't call it then, but that's what it was. And if we wanted to see somebody, or we might have to talk to them in person. And the best thing yet is write a letter. All of you remember what that was, to write a letter? Okay, when I was a teenager and we were dating, we wrote letters to each other. We didn't have text messages and all of those things. So there was a delay in communication, and it took longer to communicate. But then television came into being. I mean, I had black and white TV when I was growing up, and television was fairly recent after I was born. Once television came in, communication sped up, and there's a faster way to communicate. And now today, if a police officer gets shot in Philadelphia, it pretty much comes up on our phone within minutes. So there's no delays in communication today with the technology that we have available. But what does that have to do with mental health? That has contributed to the stigma in our society, the way technology is today, and how quickly everything is communicated. And why is that so? One of the things is because technology often brings in the negative. If you listen to the news, which I don't do very often because a lot of it could just be negative news, you don't hear the positive. When you hear the negative, it develops biases, it develops prejudices, and it makes you think negatively as well. But that's what technology does today. And we don't even know sometimes whether it's true or false. I mean, just to give you an example, we know there's a lot of scams out there today. I went to the bank this week. All I wanted to do is deposit money. I go to the drive-in, and the lady says, okay, she takes my money to deposit, and then all of a sudden I get something up on my phone from the bank that says they want to verify my identity. Now, I'm very careful with the phone because there's a lot of scams on the phone, and I just don't want to push any link. So I'm like, well, what is this? I never had to go through this before. So I look at the teller at the bank, and she's shaking her head yes, and she's pulling up the phone, like the phone. So I said, oh, well, this must be her. And I checked yes, identity, and everything went through. But we just don't know sometimes what is true and what is not true. And that's stigma as well. And that's how it is with mental illness. And television, watching movies today. A lot of the movies today, they're going to exploit the mental health person because they want to build a good storyline. And they want to really make sure that, you know, it makes you scared and it makes you anxious. So, you know, movies, again, technology, really doesn't help at all the mental health and doesn't give us the correct picture of mental health. So in your guide, there's a very interesting story of an asylum, Georgia Lunatic Asylum, and it was the largest in the world in 1860, and it housed 12,000 patients. That's a lot compared to what I know today that we would have mental health institutions. So the story is told about a General William Sherman, and this was during the time of the Civil War, and he brought troops. He brought 30 troops into town, and supplies were very scarce. Food was scarce. Yet, Sherman made sure that those people in the asylum got food to eat. And do you think that was because he was kind? We'd like to think that. Probably not. But the lead physician of the asylum knew that he was in town, and the lead physician said to him that we have 12,000 people in this asylum, and if we don't get food, I'm going to release them, and these lunatics aren't going to be locked up anymore. So General Sherman said, oh, we're going to make sure that we feed the lunatics because we don't want them out on the streets, and we don't want them affecting all of my soldiers, the federal troops that are in town. So that's just an example of what people think of asylums and mental illness. So the history of asylums has also contributed to the stigma. And one thing is people think of asylums, mental health institutions, as someplace where a person is locked up. They're like a prisoner. And that has caused some frictions with society. And the other point is that an asylum creates barriers. Now, you know, if there's a barrier, there's no communication. So you can't communicate in, you can't communicate out. So all we can do is use our imagination to think what is going on in that place. What is happening in that place? Are people being persecuted? Are they being abused? And a lot of this is because of we're uneducated about what is going on. And also there's treatments that have been used in the past. And it pictures mentally health people as not fit to come to society. And some of the things that have been used in the past, and they talked about it on the video. They've used chains, they've used straitjackets, they've padded the room, they've often taken all the patient's clothes off. And when you hear that, that plants fear into yourself, and then you have that stigma as well. So there's a story that I want to read that's in your guide. A movie came out some years ago about a young man who's attempting to help a mentally ill individual. One night, the mentally ill man called, needing assistance. The young man wasn't there, but his girlfriend was there. Having previously met the troubled man and wanting to help, she went over to his house. Soon her boyfriend returned and realized that she had gone to the man's house alone. Afraid for her safety, now remember this is a video, afraid for her safety, he immediately rushed after her, I should say a movie. When he arrived, it was too late. The movie didn't say what happened, but it gave the impression that something tragically happened, that this girl was injured or killed by this mentally ill man. So stories like this create fear in an individual. I have to tell you my own story. I had a neighbor across the street who was mentally ill, and I was afraid of that man, especially, living alone by myself, and you've got a mentally ill man across the street. It does create fear. Well, that man eventually moved, so he's not there anymore, but it's still in each one of us, when we hear stories like that, it does create fear, and we fear what that person is going to do. Is that person going to shoot me? Is that person going to choke me? Is the person going to come over and rob me of my house and all of those things? So how do we manage this fear? Okay, it's 3 points. Education is number 1. We need to understand what mental illness is, and thank you for coming to this series, because that's going to help you understand what mental health is and what it is not. And 1 in 8 people across the world, like I said, 1 in 5 in the United States, they struggle with mental illness. And we have to accept the fact that not all mentally ill people are severe mentally ill. They're not a danger to society. They're not a threat to society. In fact, the majority are the ones that are often victimized themselves, and they're not posing a danger to us. And the third point is that we need to hear more stories, and the stories we hear are probably the most severe. On the news, you'll hear mentally ill, went into a school and shot some kids, and those are the stories. Those are the worst stories that we hear. But it's unfair because it hides the fact that there's a number of mentally ill people who live normal lives, like you and me. They don't go shoot children in a school. So according to the National Institute of Mental Health, severe mental illness is fairly rare. It affects about 5% of the population over the age of 18. So a lot different than the number of people who are mentally ill. So 1 John 4:18, it's the verse is in your guide, and it might, we know, what can we learn from this verse that'll help reduce the stigma? And there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves torment. But he who fears has not been made perfect in love. Wow. So we're not perfect in love if we fear. So do we need to be afraid of mental illness? After listening to this and listening to that, do we need to be afraid? No. We don't need to be afraid. And how can we reduce the stigma? How can we reduce the fear that we have? We're all busy. We're obsessed with how much time we have. I've said many times myself, there's not enough hours in the day to do everything I need to do. So we are self-absorbed with our own endeavors, which leaves very little room for others. We don't have room for others. We love only the things that affect us. We only love the people around us. We're suspicious of everything else. But if we think more of others and less of ourselves, love can do its perfect work and casting out fear. It replaces that fear with compassion for people, and especially those in the context of what we're talking tonight, especially those with mental illness. So we want to make sure that we are not so self-absorbed that we do not have time for others, and to be compassionate to others. Your guide talks about the fall of man. We talked a little bit about that already. Eve was tempted by the serpent. She ate the fruit. She went and gave it to Adam and convinced Adam to eat it. And what's the next thing that they did? They hid from God. They were hiding from God, and God came looking for them. And God said, "Where are you?" And Adam responds, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was What? Afraid. I was afraid. So this is how mental illness affects people. They hide. They're afraid. They react to stigma. So what can be done to help them come out of their hiding? So a couple points here is, there's a norm in society, and the norm is not to be mentally ill. And that's not the accepted norm. Just like in Genesis 3, the norm was, before Adam and Eve fell, was to be sinless and to be clothed with divinity and not have clothes. But when Adam and Eve sinned, they hid. They made clothes. So in case of mental health, society has dictated what is normal and acceptable, just like Adam and Eve were thinking when they fell. The mentally health find themselves at the other end, that they're odd, they're peculiar, so they tend to hide as well. So this hiding takes many forms. They don't talk to anybody about it. They keep their mental illness a secret. They pull away from people, pull away from their friends even, quit their jobs. They deny that there's a problem. And that only pushes that person with mental illness further into isolation. And the second point is back to the fall of man. God sought out the pair. After they sinned, God went looking for them. He wasn't angry. There was no anger in his voice. There was no chastisement. He called to them as a loving father would. In order for the mentally ill to come out of hiding, we must create an environment that is safe and loved, not judged and ashamed. That is wherever you are, at work, at church, in your home. We need to create that safe environment. There's a story in 2 Kings 2:23-24, and it's a story of the prophet Elisha. You have probably heard of this story. Elisha was a bald man. Elisha was a prophet of God. And one day when he was walking to Bethel, there was a group of kids who laughed at him because he was bald. They thought it was really funny. He didn't have any hair on his head, so they laughed at him. Well, Elisha looked at them, and he called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord. And you might have heard the story, know what the curse was. 2 female bears came out of the woods, and the Bible says mauled 42 of the youths. Now, we don't know what happened to them, mauled. To me, anyone that gets mauled by a bear probably isn't going to live to talk about it. What a lesson. And we think that was a harsh punishment. But when we look at this compared to mental illness and the stigma, it raises a question. The young men chose to deride Elisha and make fun of him, resulting in a serious punishment. In the same vein, have we ever done that to mentally ill people? Have we mocked them? Did we say there's a demon in them? Do we neglect them? Do we ostracize them and don't, befriend them or think that they're not the best people in society? So we will be responsible of how we treat those people with mental struggles. We shouldn't laugh at them. We shouldn't treat them. We should treat them as God would treat them, as a loving father. We have the ability to build up and tear down. It's in our power to do that. We are able to do that. And how we do that reflects our character. The world is always going to have the strong and the weak. It's always going to have the wealthy and the poor. It's always going to have the healthy and the sick. But if you're healthy, you're not to lord it over those who are sick. You are not to think that, they didn't follow the laws of health, and that's why they're sick. We are called to be a blessing. We are not called to criticize. We are always called to be a blessing. So in the case of mental illness, those who are struggling with mental illness, we need to assist them, because if we don't, who will? We may come across them every day, and there may be nobody else but us that's going to look at them and help them. So stigma is a learned process, and as we learned on the video, anything learned can be unlearned. So we need to unlearn the stigma that we have. And ways to do that is to talk about it. Sometimes it's out of sight, out of mind. If we don't hear about it, we don't think about it. It could be an elephant in the room and we just totally ignore it. And we need to properly educate. Educate so people will know what mental illness is. Because what people think about mental illness today is not the most accurate situation. So that's what these videos are about. It's about education. It's about learning what we can do as Christians and be able to help those who are suffering from mental illness. So I want to invite you back tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock. We have different speakers, so I'll be sharing this pulpit with some others, and you can get some different viewpoints from them as well. And we just hope that you will be here, learn. If you want to invite someone to come with you, we'd love to have them. And this is important for all of us to know about mental health. Does anyone have any questions or any comments before we close? Okay. So I'm just going to have a closing prayer, so the Lord will guide us as we go home tonight. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing us here. Thank you for the education that we have received about mental health. Help us remove any stigma that we have so that we can help others and help them as you have helped us as a loving Father. Be with us now as we go home, protect us, keep us safe, and bring us back tomorrow. In Jesus' name, amen.